The North was a land of long nights and bitter winds. For the Norse people, winter was not simply a season, it was a test of endurance, a challenge that shaped every part of their lives. Hello, and welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we will travel back to the Viking Age and explore how Norse villages survived the harsh winters. We will see the houses they built, the fires they tended, the food they stored, and the quiet strength with which they endured months of cold and darkness. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss another calm journey into the past. In the lands of the Norse, the year was divided not by 4 seasons as we often imagine today, but more simply into 2, summer and winter. Summer was the time of sailing, raiding, trading, and farming. Winter, by contrast, was the long pause. When snow covered the fields, the seas grew dangerous, and the people of the North withdrew into their homes. The approach of winter was not sudden, but gradual, signaled by signs that every villager knew well. The days grew shorter, shadows stretched longer across the ground, and the sun's warmth weakened. Winds from the north began to bite, carrying with them the scent of frost. Farmers hurried to bring in their last harvests, gathering grain into storehouses and leading cattle back from summer pastures. Fishermen pulled their boats ashore, knowing that the storms to come would make the seas too dangerous for their small vessels. By late autumn, the landscape itself seemed to prepare for winter. Leaves fell from birch and ash trees. Rivers slowed as ice began to form along their banks, and the skies often turned gray for days on end. In villages, smoke from hearth fires rose steadily as families tested their stores of firewood. Roofs were checked and repaired, thatch tied tightly against the storms. Every detail mattered, for a mistake made in preparation could mean hardship or even death in the months ahead. For the Norse, winter was not only a natural cycle, it was a force to be respected, almost feared. Stories told in the long evenings described winters so harsh that livestock perished in their stalls and families huddled for warmth in their smoke-filled halls. Memory kept alive the knowledge of famine years, when food ran out before spring returned. This awareness shaped the way people lived, teaching them to gather, to plan, and to endure. Children, too, could sense the change. They helped bring in firewood, fetched water before the ice grew too thick, and watched as their parents stored away sacks of dried fish and barrels of grain. Their games shifted from fields and rivers to the hearthside, where they played with carved wooden toys in the flickering light of the fire. They listened to the voices of elders who told tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors. Stories meant not only to entertain, but to remind them of courage in times of darkness. As the first snows fell, a hush spread across the land. Roads and paths grew difficult, trade slowed, and families turned inward. The long nights began, when the sun rose late and set early, leaving many hours of darkness. In this world of cold and silence, the Norse people gathered together, sustained by fire, food, and the bonds of kinship. Winter had arrived, and with it came the challenge that would test their strength until spring returned. For Norse villagers, winter was not an event that suddenly appeared, but a slow certainty that demanded preparation. The months of warmth and light were precious, for they provided the means to survive the cold that always followed. Every household, every farmstead, and every family worked with a rhythm guided by the knowledge that the land itself would soon be locked in snow and frost. Preparing for winter was not a single task, but a way of life, a cycle repeated year after year, handed down from parents to children. Each detail remembered because to forget it was dangerous. The first stage of preparation began even in summer. As soon as crops sprouted in the fields and the fishing boats returned with their catches, families thought ahead to winter. Grain was carefully harvested, dried, and stored. Barley, oats, and rye were staples, filling sacks and wooden bins that were kept in lofts above the living spaces, safe from dampness and rodents. Villagers knew exactly how much was needed for the dark months. Enough to bake bread, enough to brew simple drinks, enough to sustain not only people but also livestock. Miscalculate, and hunger would press hard before spring returned. Preserving food was a central concern. Fish, abundant in rivers and coastal waters, were caught in great numbers during the summer and autumn and then dried in the wind or smoked over slow fires. These stores became vital when ice covered the water and boats could not sail. Meat from cattle, sheep, or pigs was salted, hung in smokehouses, or stored in cool underground pits. Dairy, too, was preserved. Milk turned into cheese and butter that would last for months. Every item of food represented security, and entire families worked together to prepare it. Hunting and gathering added to these supplies. Men ventured into forests to hunt deer, elk, or boar, while women and children collected berries, nuts, and herbs in the warmer months, drying them for use in winter stews and medicines. Honey, gathered in late summer, provided both sweetness and a source of energy. Nothing was wasted. Bones became tools, hides turned into clothing, and fat into lamps or soap. Each item gathered during the light months had a purpose when darkness came. Firewood was another necessity. Throughout autumn, men cut trees and split logs, stacking them carefully to dry. Birch and pine were common fuels, chosen for their availability and the heat they gave. Without wood, fires would falter, and without fires, houses would grow dangerously cold. Children often helped in this work, carrying smaller branches, learning how to stack them so that air could flow between logs. The sight of a full woodpile outside a house gave comfort, a visible sign that warmth was secured. Preparing houses themselves was equally important. Norse longhouses, built of timber with roofs of thatch or turf, were designed to endure winter, but they needed care. Families patched leaks, reinforced walls, and sealed cracks against the wind. Roofs were checked to ensure they could bear the weight of snow. Inside, spaces were arranged for warmth and efficiency. Livestock were often brought into the same building, housed in stalls at one end of the longhouse. Their body heat added to the warmth, and their presence ensured they could be fed and protected through the storms. Clothing, too, was prepared long before the first frost. Wool, spun from the sheep that grazed in summer pastures, was woven into cloaks, tunics, and trousers. Women spent long hours at looms, producing fabrics that were thick and warm. Furs from hunted animals provided extra insulation, especially for those who had to venture outside in the cold. Shoes were repaired, lined with wool or stuffed with straw for added warmth. Children outgrew their garments quickly, so new clothes were made each year, handed down or repurposed from older siblings. To be poorly clothed in winter was a risk no family wished to face. The work of preparation was not only physical, but also communal. Villages often gathered to share labor, building fences, repairing roofs, or slaughtering animals for the winter supply. Feasts accompanied some of these tasks, turning necessity into celebration. When livestock were culled before winter, meat was shared, and the occasion became both practical and social. Songs were sung, stories told, and bonds renewed. These gatherings reinforced the idea that survival was not only the duty of individuals, but of the entire community. Religion and ritual also played their part. Before winter set in, offerings might be made to the gods and spirits, asking for protection through the cold months. Fires were lit in honor of deities associated with the sun, warmth, and fertility, symbols of hope that light would return after the long night. Such rituals were reminders that preparation was not only about wood and food, but also about courage and spirit. The unseen forces of the world had to be respected, for the Norse knew well that survival depended on more than human effort alone. Children grew up within this rhythm, learning from their elders the details that mattered. A boy watched his father sharpen axes for woodcutting, learning the right angle of the blade. A girl helped her mother weave wool into cloth, her small hands guided until she could work alone. These lessons were not taught formally, but lived, passed from one generation to the next. The knowledge of how to prepare for winter was as essential as knowing how to breathe. It was the inheritance of every child born into the North. Even trade and travel reflected the cycle of preparation. Merchants and sailors knew that long journeys had to be completed before seas turned dangerous. Goods from distant lands, grain, salt, metals, were brought into villages during autumn, exchanged for furs, amber, or crafted items. Once snow fell, such movement was limited, and villages relied on what they had secured. The end of autumn was therefore a time of bustle, as markets filled and ships unloaded. Each transaction tied to the thought of winter ahead as the first true cold arrived. A sense of finality settled over the community. By this point, food was stored, wood stacked, clothing prepared, and houses secured. Families checked their supplies carefully, counting barrels, sacks, and bundles. Chiefs or village leaders sometimes inspected the stores of their people, ensuring that no household was left vulnerable. For though independence was prized, survival often depended on cooperation. A family that starved weakened the whole village. Thus, even in their rugged independence, the Norse recognized the need for mutual care. The coming of winter was both feared and respected, but the preparations gave confidence. To walk into a storehouse and see grain piled high, to touch a cloak newly woven, to smell the smoke of drying fish. These were reassurances that the cold could be endured. The Norse did not face winter with despair, but with determination. Their preparations were acts of hope, affirmations that life would continue, that spring would come again. In this way, the harsh season was not only a challenge, but also a reminder of resilience. Every task completed in summer and autumn was an answer to the cold. Every log stacked, every fish dried, every cloak woven said the same thing: we will endure. And when the snow finally blanketed the land, the Norse people withdrew into their homes not with surprise, but with readiness, carrying within their walls the fruits of months of careful labor. Thus, preparing for winter was more than survival. It was a way of life. It bound families together, united villages in shared effort, and wove memory and tradition into each task. It was in these preparations, quiet yet essential, that the strength of Norse society revealed itself most clearly. Before a single storm blew, before the first frost glittered on the fields, the people of the North had already fought half the battle, and they had done so with patience, skill, and the wisdom of generations. When the snows fell and the winds swept across the fjords, the true center of Norse life was not the frozen field or the storm-tossed shore, but the longhouse. This building, at once practical and symbolic, gathered families, neighbors, and even livestock under a single roof. Within its wooden walls and turf-covered roof, warmth was preserved, food was cooked, and stories were told. To survive the winter was to live within the longhouse, where daily life unfolded in patterns shaped by both necessity and tradition. The longhouse was more than a dwelling. It was an institution, a place where generations lived together, and a reflection of the society itself. Built of timber, sometimes supported by great posts sunk deep into the ground, its frame was covered with planks or wattle and daub, then roofed with thatch or turf that held in heat and resisted the weight of snow. Some stretched more than 30 meters in length, wide enough to shelter an extended family and their animals. Entering such a space during the winter months was like stepping into a world apart, dim, smoky, and warm, a refuge from the howling cold outside. At the heart of every longhouse was the fire. Unlike the hearths of modern homes, these were long, central pits, sometimes stretching for several meters. Fires burned day and night, their smoke rising through roof vents or drifting between the rafters. Light was scarce during the winter months, and the fire served as the main source of illumination. its glow reflecting off wooden beams and earthen floors. Families gathered around it for warmth, meals, and companionship. The constant tending of fire was itself a ritual. Coals had to be fed, ashes managed, and flames coaxed to life each morning. A dying fire was more than an inconvenience. It was a danger to all within. Around the fire, daily activities unfolded. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and mended garments, their hands busy in the half-light. Children played with carved toys, imitating the tasks of adults or listening to stories. Men repaired tools, sharpened blades, or carved wood into useful shapes. The smoke from the hearth dried meat, and fish hung from rafters, preserving food through the season. It blackened beams over time, leaving marks that told of generations of winters endured. The fire gave more than heat. It gave a rhythm to life, the crackling of logs marking the hours as the sun slipped low beyond the snow. Living spaces were arranged along the sides of the longhouse. Raised platforms or benches served as both beds and storage, covered with furs and woolen blankets. Families slept together, pressed close for warmth, while animals were housed in stalls at one end of the building. Cattle, sheep, and goats, though requiring care, contributed body heat to the interior. Their presence reminded everyone of the bond between humans and animals in the struggle against cold. The smell of hay and livestock mingled with smoke and stew, creating an atmosphere that was earthy, pungent, and unmistakably alive. Meals were simple but hearty, drawn from the stores prepared in summer and autumn. Pots hung above the fire, filled with stews of grain, beans, dried fish, or salted meat. Bread baked on stones or in clay ovens supplemented these meals. Herbs gathered in warmer months added flavor, while occasional feasts offered roasted meat when livestock were slaughtered or game hunted. Eating was communal, bowls and wooden. Spoons passed from hand to hand, the act of sharing reinforcing bonds of kinship. To eat together in the longhouse was to affirm survival, each bite proof that the preparations of earlier seasons had succeeded. Time in the longhouse was measured not by clocks but by tasks and by the cycles of day and night. Winter nights were long, but they were filled with activity. Spinning wheels turned, looms clacked, knives scraped against wood. Music and storytelling filled the air, breaking the monotony. Bards or elders recited sagas of gods and heroes, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of the flames. Children learned these tales by heart, carrying them into the next generation. Through story and song, the past lived within the present, giving meaning to the hardship of the season. The social structure of the longhouse reflected that of Norse society. The head of the household, often a farmer of some standing, oversaw the distribution of food and the organization of tasks. His authority was balanced by the contributions of others, for survival required everyone's effort. Women held vital roles, managing not only food and textiles, but also the care of children and animals. Their labor was constant, their skill indispensable. Elders advised, remembered, and instructed, their wisdom guiding choices. Even the youngest contributed, carrying wood, fetching water, or tending animals. The longhouse was not merely a shelter, but a cooperative system in which every member had a role. The atmosphere inside could be both comforting and oppressive. On stormy days, when winds howled outside and snow blocked paths, the house grew crowded and smoky. Darkness pressed against walls, and the air filled with the sounds of voices, coughing, laughter, and work. Yet this closeness also bound families together. In a world where isolation could be deadly, the crowded warmth of the longhouse provided security. Bonds deepened as people endured hardships side by side, finding companionship in shared space. Ritual life also continued within the longhouse. Seasonal festivals, offerings to gods, and family ceremonies took place around the hearth. Winter was a time for remembering ancestors, for calling upon spirits to guard the household. and for seeking blessings for the year to come. The fire itself carried sacred meaning, symbolizing life amid the darkness. To feed, it was not only practical but spiritual, an act of continuity linking generations past and future. Even conflict and tension had their place. Close quarters meant that disputes could not be avoided. Arguments over food, work, or authority sometimes flared, but they were tempered by the knowledge that cooperation was essential. Elders mediated, reminding the household that survival required unity. The very structure of the longhouse, with its single fire and shared space, demanded compromise. No one could withdraw entirely. All lived under the same roof. This forced an intimacy that was at once challenging and deeply human. Outside the longhouse, the world lay silent under snow, but inside, life persisted. Babies were born, couples whispered, children grew, and elders passed away. The cycle of life continued even as the land slept. In this sense, the longhouse was not merely a shelter from winter, but a world unto itself, holding within its beams the full spectrum of human experience. Archaeological evidence supports these images. Excavations of longhouse sites across Scandinavia reveal their scale, construction, and arrangement. Post holes mark the great timbers, hearths leave traces of ash, and artifacts such as spindle whorls, loom weights, knives, and gaming pieces show the daily activities that once filled the interiors. Animal bones confirm the presence of livestock, while charred grains testify to meals prepared. These remains are silent witnesses to lives once lived in smoky warmth while storms raged outside. In many ways, the longhouse was the perfect symbol of Norse resilience. It was strong, enduring, and communal. It gathered people and animals, past and present, labor and rest, all under one roof. It transformed the challenge of winter into an opportunity for togetherness, creativity, and memory. Within its walls, survival was not only physical but cultural, for it was here that traditions were preserved, stories told, and values reinforced. Thus, to imagine life in a Norse winter is to imagine life inside the longhouse. The fire crackling at the center, the smell of stew rising, the sound of children playing and elders speaking, the presence of animals shifting in their stalls, all formed a tapestry of survival. It was not easy, nor was it always comfortable, but it was deeply human. And when the snow finally melted and the sun returned, those who had endured carried with them the strength of what they had shared. The longhouse was therefore more than a building. It was the beating heart of Norse society, the shelter where winter was endured, and the place where survival was transformed into community. In its smoky warmth, the people of the North found not only protection from the cold, but also a reminder of who they were and what bound them together. In the North, the greatest enemy of winter was not the frost itself, nor the storms, nor even the long nights. It was hunger. Cold could be endured with fire, darkness with stories, but without food, no household could survive. For the Norse people, preparing for the long winter months meant creating stores of nourishment that could last from the final harvest of autumn until the return of spring. Their skill in preserving food, their careful planning, and their creativity in stretching supplies made survival possible. To understand how Norse villages endured winter, one must step into the smoke-filled storage houses, the granaries, and the kitchens of the North, where every grain and every dried fish represented hope against famine. The foundation of the winter diet was grain. Fields of barley, rye, and oats ripened in the summer sun, and when harvested in autumn, they were carefully dried, threshed, and stored in bins or sacks. Grain could be milled into flour for bread, boiled into porridge, or brewed into simple ale. Its versatility made it essential. Archaeological excavations of Viking-age settlements often reveal quern stones, hand-operated mills worn smooth by years of grinding. Women and children spent long hours turning these stones, producing the flour that sustained households. Bread, whether flat and unleavened or raised with natural yeasts, formed the daily staple, eaten at nearly every meal. Vegetables, though less celebrated in sagas, were equally important. Cabbages, leeks, onions, and turnips were common, hardy crops that grew well in the northern soil. They were harvested before frost and stored in pits dug into the ground, insulated with straw and earth. Root vegetables in particular could last for months if kept cool and dry. Beans and peas were dried and stored in sacks, ready to be boiled into stews. These provided vital nutrition during the dark months, when fresh produce was scarce. For many households, a pot of grain and beans simmering over the fire was the essence of winter sustenance. Fish played a crucial role, especially in coastal and riverine communities. During summer and autumn, fishermen caught vast quantities of cod, herring, and salmon. These were preserved by drying in the wind, salting, or smoking over slow fires. In northern Norway and Iceland, the practice of air-drying cod produced stockfish, a food that could last for years if kept dry. Such supplies were invaluable, providing protein long after seas froze or storms prevented fishing. Inland villages, too, relied on rivers and lakes, catching pike, trout, and eels, then preserving them in similar ways. Fish hung from rafters in smoky longhouses or were stored in sheds, the smell a constant reminder of the stores waiting for use. Meat was more seasonal, but no less important. Livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs could not all be kept through winter, for fodder was limited. In late autumn, families slaughtered animals, keeping only enough breeding stock to survive until spring. The meat was salted, smoked, or dried. Pork was particularly valued, its fat providing essential calories. Beef and mutton added variety, though their preservation required careful management. Bones were boiled to extract every trace of nourishment, producing broths that warmed the body on cold nights. Nothing was wasted. Hides became clothing, sinews became bowstrings, and fat became lamp fuel. Dairy products offered another source of sustenance. In summer, cows and goats produced ample milk, which was churned into butter or curdled into cheese. These products were easier to store and transport than fresh milk, and they lasted well into winter. Butter, kept in wooden tubs or clay vessels, provided both flavor and energy. Cheese, ranging from soft curds to harder-aged varieties, could be eaten alone or added to stews. Archaeological finds of butter buried in bogs suggest that preservation methods varied, and some were surprisingly effective. For sweetness, honey was prized. Bees were kept in some regions, and honey gathered in late summer was stored for use in both food and drink. It sweetened porridge, flavored sauces, and, when fermented, produced mead. Though not a daily staple, honey symbolized abundance, a taste of luxury amid the plain fare of winter. Fruits also played a role. Apples, plums, and berries were dried or stored in cool places. Even in winter, a handful of dried berries could brighten a meal and provide vitamins essential for health. Preservation was as much an art as a science. Smoking required slow, steady fires that produced plenty of smoke without consuming the food. Salting demanded access to salt, a valuable commodity often obtained through trade. Drying depended on weather, with racks built to take advantage of wind and sun. Each method required knowledge and patience, passed down through generations. Mistakes could be costly. Spoiled meat or moldy grain meant hunger. Thus, preserving food was not only work, but a form of wisdom, carefully tended year after year. Meals during winter reflected both necessity and creativity. Stews were common, as they allowed small amounts of meat to flavor large quantities of grain and vegetables. Bread accompanied nearly every dish, sometimes spread with butter, sometimes dipped into broth. On ordinary days, the fare was plain, but on festivals or special occasions, feasts were held. Then, roasted meats, richer stews, and even imported delicacies appeared on the table. Feasting was more than indulgence. It was a reaffirmation of community and hope during the darkest months. Inside the longhouse, cooking was done over the central hearth. Large cauldrons hung from chains, pots rested on stones, and bread baked on flat surfaces. The smell of simmering stews filled the air, mingling with the smoke that drifted upward. Children watched as mothers stirred pots, learning recipes that had been followed for generations. Each household had its own variations, shaped by what resources were available. In coastal villages, fish stews dominated. Inland, meat and grains prevailed. But everywhere, the rhythm was the same. Simple, nourishing meals prepared daily, keeping bodies strong through the cold. The sharing of food reinforced bonds within the household and the wider community. Chiefs and wealthier farmers often hosted feasts, distributing meat and drink to neighbors. Such generosity was a measure of leadership, ensuring loyalty and gratitude. In lean times, these gatherings took on even greater meaning, for they reminded everyone that survival was a collective endeavor. To eat together was to endure together, and to endure together was to overcome the winter. Religion also touched the diet. Offerings of food were sometimes made to gods or spirits, placed in sacred groves or at household altars. A portion of a slaughtered animal might be dedicated before the rest was consumed. These acts reflected the belief that survival was not only a matter of human effort, but also of divine favor. Eating, like farming and hunting, was part of a larger cycle that included gods, ancestors, and nature itself. Despite all preparations, hunger was never far away. Some winters were harsher than others, and supplies ran low before spring returned. In such years, meals grew smaller, bread thinner, and stews more watery. Stories of famine haunted memory, reminding each generation of the fragility of survival. Yet, even in such times, the Norse people endured, relying on resilience, ingenuity, and the strength of their communities. Archaeological evidence confirms much of this picture. Finds of charred grains, animal bones, fish hooks, and cooking vessels reveal the diet of Viking Age households. Storage pits, lined with stones and straw, show how vegetables were preserved. Traces of smoke on timbers, residues in pottery, and the remains of corn stones all testify to the daily labor of preparing and consuming food. These remains may be silent, but they speak clearly of a people who understood the challenge of winter and met it with skill that in the end, the winter diet of the Norse was not about luxury, but about endurance. Bread, porridge, stews, dried fish, salted meat, cheese, and butter formed the backbone of survival. Yet within this simplicity lay richness, the creativity of preservation, the sharing of meals, the rituals of feasting, and the memory of generations who had done the same. Each bite carried not only nourishment, but also continuity, a reminder that life persisted even in the harshest cold. Thus, food and its preservation were the quiet triumphs of Norse villages. Long before the storms came, they had already fought the battle of hunger, filling their stores with the work of summer and autumn. When snow lay deep and darkness lingered, they reached for dried fish, for salted pork, for bread baked from stored grain, and in doing so, they reached also for hope. The winter diet was therefore more than sustenance. It was survival itself, shaped by wisdom, labor, and the unyielding determination of a people who refused to let the cold claim them. The long winters of the North were not only a test of food and firewood. They were also a test of the body itself, of how well it could be wrapped, protected, and shielded against the relentless cold. For the Norse villagers, survival depended as much on the garments they wore as on the meals they ate. Clothing was not fashion in the modern sense. It was protection, a second skin that allowed men, women, and children to endure days when frost clung to every branch and wind swept snow across the land. To understand how Norse villages survived the cold, one must look closely at the cloaks, the tunics, the furs, and the quiet art of endurance woven into every thread. Wool was the foundation of Norse winter clothing. Sheep, tended through summer and autumn, provided fleeces that were shorn, cleaned, carded, and spun into yarn. Women worked at looms and longhouses, weaving this yarn into cloth. Wool had many advantages. It was warm, durable, and even when damp it retained heat. A simple woolen tunic, worn over undergarments, could protect against bitter winds, while thicker cloaks layered above offered further warmth. The texture varied depending on the weaving technique. Some fabrics were coarse for work, others fine for special occasions. But in every case, wool was life's shield against the cold. Cloaks were especially important. Worn draped over the shoulders and fastened with brooches, they served as outer layers, shielding against snow and wind. A cloak could also be drawn around the body at night, serving as an extra blanket on sleeping benches. Archaeological finds of ornate brooches and pins remind us that cloaks were not only practical, but also opportunities for display. A well-woven, brightly dyed cloak showed both wealth and skill, while still serving the most basic need of survival. Trousers and leg coverings were equally vital. Men wore woolen trousers or leggings, bound at the ankles to keep in warmth. Women wore long dresses layered with aprons, the heavy wool falling to protect their legs. Both sexes used wraps of cloth or leather for their feet and calves, tied with straps to keep out snow. These were not luxuries, but necessities, for frostbite was a constant danger in exposed limbs. Children, too, were bundled in layers, their smaller bodies needing extra care to retain heat. Fur added further insulation. The hides of deer, elk, fox, and bear provided cloaks, hats, and linings for garments. Fur was especially valued for its softness and ability to trap warmth. Mittens of fur or wool kept hands from freezing, while hats with fur linings shielded ears and heads. The sight of villagers moving through snow, cloaks flapping and fur hats pulled low, must have been common across winter landscapes. To wear fur was to carry a fragment of the wild into the household, a reminder that animals shared in the struggle for survival. Shoes were simple but carefully made. Leather, softened and shaped, was stitched into boots or low shoes. Inside, wool or straw was packed to provide insulation. Straps tied them firmly around the foot, keeping out snow and water as best as possible. In wetter climates, this protection was imperfect, and shoes had to be dried carefully by the hearth each night. Still, they served their purpose, allowing people to move about the village, tend animals, and fetch wood even in deep winter. Layers were the secret of endurance. A Norse villager did not wear a single heavy garment, but many lighter ones combined. Undergarments of linen, where available, were soft against the skin, while woolen tunics and cloaks added thickness. Furs topped these layers when the cold was sharpest. This system allowed flexibility. Clothing could be adjusted for work, for rest, or for different weathers. In this sense, the Norse had already mastered a principle still used in cold climates today, that of layering for warmth. Color, too, had its role. Natural dyes produced reds, blues, greens, and yellows, brightening the winter world. To see a family gathered around a fire in cloaks of many shades must have been a comfort amid the gray of snow and sky. These colors carried meanings of status and beauty, but they also lifted spirits. In a season where darkness ruled, the glow of a dyed cloak or patterned tunic was more than decoration. It was a reminder of life's vibrancy persisting through the cold. Clothing was not only for warmth, but also for identity. Brooches, belts, and ornaments marked status. A farmer might wear plain wool and leather, while a chieftain might fasten his cloak with silver, his garments edged with embroidery, his shoes lined with finer furs. These distinctions were visible in gatherings and feasts, where even in winter people displayed wealth through what they wore. Yet underneath the layers, the purpose was the same: to keep body and spirit intact until spring returned. The daily routine of maintaining clothing was itself a form of endurance. Garments wore out quickly under the strain of constant use. Wool had to be rewoven or patched, leather shoes mended, furs brushed and cared for. Women bore much of this labor, spinning yarn, weaving cloth, sewing garments, and repairing tears. Their work, though often unrecorded in sagas, was essential. Without their skill, warriors could not march, children could not play in the snow, and elders could not sit in warmth. Every stitch was an act of survival, every garment a shield created by patient hands. Inside the longhouse, warmth was preserved not only by clothing, but by clever use of space. Sleeping benches were lined with furs, and families slept close together, sharing body heat beneath cloaks and blankets. Livestock added further warmth, their stalls at one end of the building contributing to the overall temperature. Fires burned constantly, smoke seeping through the roof, insulating rafters with soot. Warmth was never taken for granted. It was created, tended, and shared. The art of endurance extended beyond garments. It was a mindset as much as a material. Villagers knew that winter would test their patience. They endured not by expecting comfort, but by accepting hardship as part of life. Clothing eased the cold, but the true endurance lay in the spirit, in the quiet determination to outlast the season. Stories, songs, and companionship were as necessary as cloaks and boots. Together, they wrapped the people of the North in layers of resilience. Archaeological remains confirm much of this picture. Finds of woolen fragments, woven textiles, brooches, and leather shoes show the variety and durability of Norse clothing. Graves reveal individuals buried with cloaks fastened by ornate pins, or with furs and ornaments marking status. The survival of these objects, despite centuries in the earth, testifies to the importance placed upon clothing not only in life, but also in death. A cloak could protect a body against winter, and it could accompany a spirit into the next world. Thus, the story of clothing in Norse winter is not merely about fabric. It is about the weaving of endurance into every thread. It is about the art of survival, where each garment, each stitch, each patch reflected the determination of a people who faced the cold with courage. In their wool, their furs, their cloaks, and their layered garments, the Norse found not only warmth but a way of life, an art of enduring that carried them through long months of snow and darkness. And so, when one imagines the Viking winter, picture not only the roaring fire or the stored food, but also the cloaked figures stepping out into the snow, their garments wrapped tightly, their breath steaming in the air, their faces resolute. Clothing was their armor against the season, and endurance was their triumph. Together, they made survival possible, year after year, through the long winters of the North. When the snow lay heavy on the land and the fields slept beneath their frozen blankets, life in a Norse village did not stop. The work simply changed its shape. Tasks that filled the summer, plowing, sowing, fishing in open waters, gave way to chores suited to the season. Winter was slower, quieter, but it was never idle. The rhythm of each day was marked by the fire's glow, the sound of tools in the longhouse, and the endless need to prepare for spring. Survival meant more than simply waiting for warmer weather. It meant filling the long, dark months with useful labor, ensuring that the household remained strong when the earth awoke again. Inside the longhouse, daily chores revolved around care for the hearth. The fire was never allowed to die. Each morning, coals from the night before were stirred, new logs added, and flames coaxed to life. Smoke curled upward, filling the rafters before finding its way out. This constant tending was the duty of all, from children who fetched kindling to elders who gave advice on managing the flames. Without fire, food could not be cooked, warmth could not be kept, and life inside the house would wither. Thus, The hearth was the first task of the day and the last before sleep. Cooking, too, was a daily labor that required planning and effort. Women managed stores of grain, fish, and meat, measuring portions carefully to last through the months. Porridge simmered slowly, stews bubbled with beans and dried herbs, and bread was baked on stones. Each meal was a balance between nourishment and preservation. Waste was avoided at all costs. Every scrap of food had value. Bones were boiled until they gave up their marrow. Fat was rendered into tallow, and even fish heads found their way into broths. Through such thrift, supplies stretched further, and the threat of hunger receded. Clothing repair was another constant task. Winter garments were quickly under daily use. Woolen cloaks frayed at the edges, shoes cracked from snow and damp, and mittens lost their stitches. Women sat by the fire with needles of bone or metal, patching and darning. New cloth was woven on looms, thread spun from wool stored after shearing. Children helped by carding fleece or twisting yarn. These quiet labors were vital. A cloak well mended might mean the difference between comfort and suffering in the cold. The sound of the loom, rhythmic and steady, became a background to winter days, its clack marking the passage of time. Tools and weapons also required attention. Men repaired axes dulled by woodcutting, straightened spear shafts, and sharpened knives. Farmers checked plows and carts, ensuring they would be ready when the thaw came. Hunters prepared bows, fletched arrows, and mended nets. Winter provided the time for such maintenance, when the demands of the fields were absent. Blacksmiths were present, worked at their forges, shaping iron into nails, fittings, or blades. Though the heat of the forge was welcome, the work was heavy, and sparks flew into the dim air of the longhouse. Each strike of the hammer was a promise of readiness for spring. Caring for animals filled much of the day. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were sheltered in stalls at one end of the longhouse or in barns nearby. They needed feeding, watering, and cleaning. Hay and fodder had been stored during summer, but managing these supplies required care. Too much given at once, and the stores would vanish before the snow melted. Too little, and the animals would weaken. Children carried bundles of hay, poured water into troughs, and learned the patience of tending creatures through the long season. The health of livestock meant survival, for they would provide milk, wool, meat, and strength when the world thawed. Fetching water was another daily necessity. Streams and wells froze, so holes were cut through ice, buckets lowered, and water carried back. This was hard, cold work, often given to younger members of the household. The sight of children trudging with buckets, their breath misting in the air, was common across winter villages. Water was used not only for drinking, but also for cooking, washing, and brewing. Each trip to the well or stream reminded villagers of their dependence on nature's rhythms. Entertainment and labor often blurred together. Storytelling accompanied spinning, songs lightened the work of weaving, and games filled pauses between chores. Children carved toys from wood, adults played board games such as Nefataful, and riddles were exchanged around the fire. These diversions were not wasted time. They bound the household together, kept spirits high, and filled the long hours of darkness. Even laughter became a form of survival, warding off the despair that could come with endless cold. Festivals punctuated the winter rhythm, providing moments of joy and release. Feasts were held when livestock were slaughtered or when the solstice arrived. These gatherings offered more than food. They offered renewal. Songs, dances, and rituals reminded villagers of the cycles of nature, of the promise that light would return. Such celebrations gave meaning to endurance, turning mere survival into a story of hope. The rhythm of winter days was not uniform, of course. Storms might confine families to the longhouse for days, making the air thick with smoke and voices. On calmer days, men ventured out to hunt, trap, or gather wood. Snares caught rabbits and foxes, while hunters brought back occasional deer. Woodcutting was constant, for fires consumed logs faster than expected. Each day required adaptation to weather, resources, and need. Flexibility was as important as routine. Children learned through imitation. A boy watched his father repair a tool, then tried his own hand. A girl helped her mother stir the pot, then learned to weave her first threads. These lessons were gradual but unceasing. By the time children reached adolescence, they knew the full cycle of chores required for survival. Winter was therefore a school as much as a season, its curriculum written in necessity rather than books. Even in hardship, there was pride. To see one's household well-fed, warmly clothed, and active through the winter was a sign of competence. Chiefs and wealthier farmers displayed their ability through generosity, inviting neighbors to share meals or giving gifts of food. Honor was tied not only to bravery in battle, but also to success in managing a household through the cold. A man or woman who kept their family safe through winter commanded respect. Archaeological evidence adds depth to this picture. Loom weights, spindle whorls, bone needles, and iron shears found in settlements testify to the constant work of textile production. Wooden buckets and troughs, often preserved in bogs, show the tools of watering and feeding. Animal bones reveal the careful management of livestock, while cornstones speak of daily grinding for bread. These remains, though silent, are echoes of the rhythm of winter days. Chores repeated countless times, each one essential in the end. The winter rhythm was not a burden, but a structure. It gave shape to days that might otherwise blur into endless darkness. Each chore, though small, was meaningful. Together, they formed a pattern of endurance. Tending the fire, cooking meals, repairing clothes, caring for animals, fetching water, telling stories, singing songs. This rhythm was the heartbeat of survival. Thus, the Norse villagers did not merely wait for winter to pass. They lived through it with diligence, patience, and quiet strength. Their work and chores were not grand or dramatic, but they were the foundation upon which life continued. In the steady repetition of tasks, in the shared labor of households, and in the rhythm of winter days, the art of survival was perfected. Winter in the north was long and demanding, yet within the cold months lay moments of laughter, companionship, and shared joy. For the Norse villagers, survival depended not only on food and fire, but also on the bonds of community. These bonds were strengthened by simple games played by children and adults alike, by feasts where food was shared generously, and by the warmth of gathering together. In such moments, the harshness of the season was softened, and people remembered that endurance was easier when carried together. Games were woven into the fabric of winter days. Children, confined indoors by snow and wind, carved small toys from wood. Animals, carts, and boats were shaped with knives, painted with simple colors, and pushed along earthen floors. Spinning tops made from bone clattered across the benches, while dolls of cloth and straw were tucked into beds of fur. These toys, humble though they were, filled hours with laughter. They also trained young minds and hands, teaching balance, imagination, and patience. Older children and adults played more structured games. One of the most beloved was Nefadafel, a board game of strategy where one side sought to protect a king while the other tried to capture him. Boards were carved into wooden planks or scratched into tabletops, and pieces were made from stone, bone, or glass. The game required foresight, cunning, and calm thought, skills prized in daily life as well as in play. On long nights, families gathered around the fire, moving pieces slowly, debating strategies, and cheering quiet victories. The glow of the fire lit the board, while outside snow fell silently. Other games were simpler. Knucklebones, made from the ankle bones of animals, were tossed in patterns, the outcomes laughed over by players. Tug-of-war contests tested strength, even indoors when ropes could be tied to beams. Story riddles entertained listeners, with clever questions and witty answers exchanged across generations. These diversions were not grand, but they carried the weight of community. To laugh together in the cold was to feel less alone, to push back the endless night with joy. Physical contests also played a role. When weather allowed, villagers ventured outside for wrestling, running, or simple snow play. Wrestling, in particular, was a favorite among men and boys, testing strength and skill. Such contests, though playful, also reinforced readiness for hardship. A strong grip, balance on icy ground, and endurance in the cold were all valuable traits. Children imitated these games, learning resilience through laughter. Even in snow, voices rang with cheer, a counterpoint to the silence of winter. Feasts were another anchor of community spirit. Though supplies were carefully rationed, there were times when food was shared in abundance. Slaughtering livestock in late autumn provided meat that could not always be preserved, so large meals were prepared. Families gathered, neighbors invited, and long tables filled with roasted cuts, stews, and bread. These feasts were moments of plenty, reminders that even in scarcity, there could be celebration. Cooking for feasts involved the whole household. Fires burned hotter, cauldrons bubbled with rich stews of meat, beans, and herbs, and bread baked in larger quantities. Butter, cheese, and dried fruits added variety. For drink, ale brewed from grain or mead sweetened with honey might be poured, offering warmth and cheer. The aroma filled the longhouse, mingling with smoke and laughter, creating a memory that lingered long after the meal was over. A tea the table, everyone shared. Wooden bowls passed from hand to hand, meat carved and distributed fairly. Children sat wide-eyed, tasting dishes richer than the daily fare. Elders spoke, telling stories between bites, their voices steady and calm. Younger men boasted of strength, women teased one another over their weaving, and laughter rose freely. The feast was not only about food, but about connection, about the joy of togetherness. Feasts also reinforced trust within the community. A household that invited others to share its stores displayed generosity and strength. Neighbors remembered such kindness and returned it in times of need. In this way, feasts acted as social glue, binding families together not only in merriment, but in obligation. To eat together was to affirm loyalty, to create bonds that might one day mean survival. Music often accompanied these gatherings. Simple instruments, flutes of bone, drums of skin, lyres of wood, filled the air with rhythm. Songs were sung, some lighthearted, others reflective, and voices joined in chorus. Even those with little skill in music could clap, hum, or tap feet, contributing to the sound. Music lifted spirits, easing the weight of long nights. In its harmony, villagers found a mirror of their own unity. Storytelling flowed freely in such company. After bowls were emptied and fires burned lower, tales of ancestors, adventures, and clever tricks entertained all. The same stories told around quiet hearths gained new life in the warmth of a crowd. The sound of laughter, the sight of nodding heads, the echo of applause, all gave strength to the teller and joy to the listeners. Stories reminded everyone that they were part of a larger whole, that their struggles and triumphs echoed those of their kin. The spirit of community extended beyond feasts. Daily chores were often shared, and the act of helping a neighbor was as much a part of winter life as tending one's own fire. When wood was scarce, a stronger family might share with one in need. When sickness struck, food was carried across snowy paths to those who could not cook. These acts were remembered, strengthening ties that bound villages together. In winter, generosity was not an extra, it was survival. Children felt this spirit most strongly. They grew up surrounded by laughter, sharing, and companionship. Games taught them patience, feasts taught them generosity, and the constant presence of others taught them resilience. They learned early that survival was never solitary. To endure the winter was to endure together, to laugh, to share, to work side by side. Archaeological finds confirm these patterns. Boards etched for Nefataful, bone gaming pieces, and carved toys have been uncovered across Viking Age sites. Animal bones show evidence of feasting, with cuts of meat prepared in ways consistent with large gatherings. Musical instruments, harps, flutes, and drums, have been found, silent reminders of songs once sung. These objects, though quiet now, speak of laughter and companionship that filled longhouses centuries ago. In the end, games and feasts were more than diversions. They were tools of survival, just as vital as axes or cloaks. They filled the darkness with sound and joy. They bound households into communities, and they reminded everyone that hardship was shared. A winter without laughter would be unbearable. A winter without community would be impossible. Through play, through food, and through togetherness, the Norse people transformed the long months of snow into seasons of resilience. Thus, when one imagines a Viking winter, do not picture only the silence of snow or the labor of survival. Picture also the laughter of children with wooden toys, the steady concentration of a board game by the fire, the joy of meat carved at a feast, the chorus of voices lifted in song. In these moments, the spirit of community shone brightest. It was this spirit, as much as food or clothing, that carried Norse villages through the cold and into the light of spring. Though winter pressed heavily on the Norse world, villages were never entirely isolated. Snow, ice, and storms made life harder, yet people remained connected to neighboring farms, to trading routes, and even to distant lands. For the Norse, travel and exchange were threads that bound communities together, ensuring survival not only through stored supplies, but also through networks of cooperation. Winter limited movement, but it did not end it. Instead, it reshaped it, turning travel into a slower, more deliberate affair and trade into a lifeline that carried warmth, food, and news across frozen landscapes. The geography of Scandinavia shaped these patterns. Villages nestled along fjords, rivers, and coasts were tied together by water in summer, when ships could sail freely. In winter, ice closed many routes, yet travel continued over frozen ground. Sledges pulled by horses or oxen glided across snow, carrying goods from one settlement to another. People strapped on simple skis or snowshoes, moving steadily across white fields, their cloaks pulled tight, their breath misting in the air. Though slower than summer voyages, such winter travel was steady, reliable, and deeply necessary. Trade in winter was not about luxury, but about essentials. Salt, used to preserve meat and fish, was precious. Grain, when one village had more than it needed, could be exchanged for wool or hides from another. Iron tools and nails, crafted by blacksmiths, moved between households. Fish from coastal villages reached inland farms, while animal skins from forests traveled outward to trading posts. Each exchange lessened risk, for no household could rely solely on its own stores. To share was to strengthen the chain of survival. Markets sometimes appeared even in the cold months. Villagers gathered in central places, setting up stalls in barns or open areas swept clear of snow. Here, bundles of wool, sacks of beans, dried fish, and smoked meat changed hands. Coins were used in some regions, but barter remained common, with goods traded directly. Such markets were also social events, chances to greet neighbors, share news, and reaffirm bonds. Even in the depths of winter, the human need for contact remained, and trade provided the excuse. Travel was also driven by necessity beyond trade. Messengers carried news between villages, warnings of storms, reports of sickness, or calls for aid. Chiefs sent envoys to allies, ensuring that agreements remained firm. Families visited kin in nearby settlements, bringing gifts of food or cloth. Such journeys were never easy, but they reinforced ties of kinship and loyalty. To To arrive at a neighbor's longhouse, shaking snow from one's cloak, and to be welcomed by the fire was a moment of reassurance, proof that bonds still held. Longer journeys were rarer, but not impossible. Traders and sailors, hardened by experience, sometimes ventured out even in cold months. Coastal waters, though dangerous, could be navigated by those skilled enough to read the weather. Ships carried goods to larger towns or trading posts, connecting villages to broader networks. From these posts came goods not native to the north, salt from the south, fine cloth, or even exotic trinkets from distant lands. Though fewer in winter, such exchanges reminded villagers that their world was larger than the snow around them. Travel in winter had its own techniques. Roads were often impassable with mud in warmer months, but in winter, when frozen hard, they could be easier to cross. Sledges slid smoothly where carts once struggled. Snowshoes spread weight across icy surfaces, allowing hunters and messengers to move steadily. Simple skis, long planks with straps for the feet, carried people across valleys. These inventions turned hardship into opportunity, transforming snow into a surface that carried rather than hindered. Hospitality was a central part of this system. A traveler caught in the snow needed shelter, and longhouses opened their doors. To refuse hospitality was dangerous, for one never knew when one's own kin might be the traveler in need. Thus, visitors were given a place by the fire, a bowl of stew, and space to rest. In return, they brought news, stories, and sometimes small gifts. Such customs ensured that even in isolation, villages remained connected by kindness. Contact beyond the village also carried stories of distant places. Travelers spoke of markets in larger towns, of ships sighted on coasts, of alliances formed and broken. These tales, passed from ear to ear, fed imagination and knowledge alike. A boy listening by the fire might learn of lands beyond the sea. A farmer might hear of new tools or crops. Information, like food, was a resource, traded and treasured. Archaeological finds bear witness to these connections. Scales and weights used for trade, coins from faraway regions, and goods such as glass beads or silver ornaments show that even remote villages participated in wider networks. Skis preserved. In bogs, sledges reconstructed from fragments, and traces of roads carved through forests confirm the means of travel. These remains tell us that the Norse were not isolated survivors, but participants in a web of exchange that stretched across their world and beyond. The rhythm of trade and travel in winter was slower, quieter, but no less vital. It kept hunger at bay, spirits lifted, and communities united. It ensured that no village stood alone, that resources could be balanced, and that news could flow. Without these networks, survival would have been harder and isolation more dangerous. Thus, when imagining a Viking winter, one must picture not only the stillness of snow and the warmth of the hearth, but also the movement of sledges across frozen fields, the steady step of a traveler with a staff, the welcome of neighbors at a doorway, and the quiet bustle of a winter market. These images remind us that survival was never solitary, but always shared, carried along snowy paths and across frozen waters by the enduring strength of community. And so, the Viking winter slowly fades from our sight. We have walked with the Norse villagers through long nights and heavy snows, sat beside their fires, tasted their bread and stews, and listened to the laughter of children at play. We have seen how wool and fur wrapped their bodies, how games and feasts warmed their spirits, and how trade and travel kept them connected even when storms closed in. The story of their survival was not one of comfort, but of resilience. Each chore, each cloak, each loaf of bread was a quiet act of endurance. Within the longhouse, with smoke drifting upward and voices echoing through the dark, life continued. Winter, no matter how harsh, could not silence the human will to endure together. Though centuries have passed, the lessons remain. Preparation, community, and patience carried the Norse through the hardest months. Their lives remind us that survival is not only about strength of body, but about unity of spirit. As the snow outside their world melted into streams and the sun rose higher each day, the Norse stepped once more into fields, onto ships, and toward the coming summer. But within their memory, winter always returned, shaping who they were and how they lived. Now, as you rest, let the quiet of their story settle around you like a warm cloak. The fire is burning low, the longhouse is still, and beyond the walls, the winter night lies silent. Sleep well, knowing that you have shared in the endurance of a people who faced the cold and carried one another through it. Thank you for listening to Boring History for Sleep. If you enjoyed this gentle journey into the past, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you can join again for more calm histories to guide you into rest. Good night.